Happens when you design something that's just too good? So good, in fact, that it becomes a problem for the very company that built it? Well, that's the story of one of Detroit's most legendary and controversial engines, the Ford 351 Cleveland. It's a fascinating case study of an engine that rewrote the rules right before it was erased from the rulebook by its own creators.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the enigma of its creation, then get into the nitty-gritty of its design philosophy. From there, we'll see how it absolutely dominated on the racetrack, and then unpack the idea that it became a victim of its own success. And finally, we'll look at the powerful legacy it still has today.
All right, let's set the stage. Picture it, the late 1960s. American streets are ruled by muscle cars, and the horsepower wars are at a fever pitch. Ford, GM, Chrysler, they're all locked in this brutal fight for supremacy, and the only path to victory was pure, unadulterated power.
So, inside Ford's engine plant in Cleveland, Ohio, a group of engineers got their marching orders, and they were simple. Build a mid-sized V8 that would not just compete, but absolutely crush everything in its path. What they came up with was the 351 Cleveland, and it wasn't just another engine, it was a total revolution. But here's where the mystery really begins. After just 5 short years, that's it, 5 years, Ford killed it. The official line blames the oil crisis and new emissions laws, the usual suspects. But the whispers around the industry, the stories you hear from the old-timers, they tell a very different story. The Cleveland was just too good for its own good.
So what was the secret sauce? What made this engine so incredibly special? Let's pop the hood and dive into the engineering, because this is where you see it was a true masterpiece of performance design.
First off, the foundation of this thing was built like a fortress. It had 4-bolt main bearing caps. Now, for the non-engineers out there, that's a feature that clamps the engine's crankshaft, its spinning backbone, into the block with incredible force. This was pure race engine tech, stuff you just didn't see on a regular production motor. It was a clear sign that Ford built this thing to scream at high RPMs.
But the real genius, the absolute game changer, was in the cylinder heads. The Cleveland used what's called a canted-valve design. Instead of the valves going straight up and down, they were tilted at an angle. Think of it like opening a door wider. This simple-sounding change allowed the engine to breathe in a massive amount of air and fuel, especially at high speeds. It was Ford's brilliant way of getting Hemi-like airflow without actually copying Chrysler's patented Hemi design.
And speaking of breathing, the valves themselves were enormous. On the high-performance 4-barrel, or 4V versions, the intake valves were a whopping 2.19 inches across. To put that in perspective, that's a size you'd normally find on a giant big-block racing engine. This thing could inhale like an Olympic sprinter, and all that air meant one thing: incredible power.
So when you put the Cleveland up against a typical V8 of the time, it's just no contest. Canted valves, 4-bolt mains, it was in another dimension. And that factory horsepower rating of 300? Yeah, you can pretty much ignore that. It was a classic case of sandbagging. Real-world tests showed it was making closer to 350 horsepower, a little trick to keep insurance costs down for buyers.
Now, all this amazing engineering wasn't just theory. The second this engine hit the racetrack, it wasn't just competitive. It was an absolute monster. It pretty much forced the entire world of motorsport to react.
Take 1971, for example. The Mustang Boss 351, with that Cleveland heart, just walked away with the SCCA Trans Am series. That high RPM breathing capability we talked about, it left everyone else in the dust. It was so fast that officials actually had to change the rules mid-season just to give the other guys a fighting chance.
And over in NASCAR, it was the exact same story. Teams quickly figured out what a monster they had on their hands. Just listen to this from a period NASCAR engineering report. With just basic tuning, they were finding an extra 40 to 50 horsepower over the competition. It wasn't in the same league. It was playing a different sport altogether.
And don't think for a second this was just an American phenomenon. No way. The Cleveland went global. It dominated the Australian Touring Car Championship for years. It even showed up at Le Mans and other cars and snagged surprise class victories. Everywhere this engine went, it won, and it usually prompted a rule change to slow it down.
So, this brings us right back to that big, central question. You've got a world beater, an engine that wins everywhere it goes. Why on earth would you get rid of it? Well, the answer seems to be a messy cocktail of corporate politics, marketing headaches, and the engine's own unbelievable success. Now, if you look at Ford's official rationale, they'll point to the oil crisis, new EPA emission standards, and high production costs. All plausible. But then there's the internal reality, the story that gets whispered in the hallways. The Cleveland was simply outperforming more expensive engines, creating a huge internal headache and making a lot of people nervous. And here was the real problem for Ford's bean counters and marketing folks. Their mid-size, relatively affordable 351 Cleveland was consistently walking all over their premier, top-dollar big block V8s. Imagine trying to sell that. Hey, pay more money for our prestigious big block, which is actually slower than the cheaper engine. It was a marketing nightmare. It completely broke their product hierarchy.
So Ford was caught between a rock and a hard place. You've got external pressures from the government and the gas crisis. You've got internal pressure because your product lineup makes no sense. They had to make a choice. And in the end, they decided to simplify. The Cleveland, with its complex design and high cost, was deemed expendable.
But even though production stopped in 1974, the story was far from over. The Cleveland may have had a short life, but its ghost, its engineering legacy, is arguably more powerful today than ever before.
If you need proof, just try to buy one. An original, pristine set of 4V heads in a block can easily run you over $12,000 today. And that's not just nostalgia talking. That's the market recognizing just how advanced, how special that piece of engineering really was.
And you can still see its design DNA today. Look under the hood of a modern high-performance engine, like Ford's own brilliant 5.0-liter Coyote V8. That engine's ability to rev to the moon and make incredible power, the philosophy behind it, the focus on superior airflow through advanced valve design, you can trace a direct line from that right back to the 351 Cleveland. So in the end, the Cleveland wasn't really silenced by some shadowy conspiracy. It was more like a perfect storm. It was retired by a combination of market forces, new regulations, and ironically, its own disruptive, world-beating excellence. It was a brief, brilliant moment when pure engineering ambition got way out ahead of the business plan.
And that leaves us with a question that's just as relevant today as it was 50 years ago. At what point does an amazing innovation stop being an asset and actually become a liability? The story of the 351 Cleveland is a powerful, timeless reminder that in the business of building cars, sometimes you can actually be too good for your own good.